Hello and welcome to Biology Lessons to Go. In today's lesson, we'll be exploring an introduction to medical ecology with a focus on population ecology. Now, ecology is a study of how organisms interact with one another and with their non-living environments. It seeks to understand the vital connections between plants and animals and the world around them. Ecology provides information about the benefits of ecosystems and how we can best use Earth's resources in ways that will leave the environment healthy for future generations. Now, medical ecology is an emerging discipline that will assess aspects of the environment and the way that they impact human health. For example, the degradation of air, water, and food, which can lead to disease. Some examples of focus that could be associated with medical ecology might include, on the left, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is a collection of marine debris. It's basically litter that ends up in the oceans. It spans waters from the west coast all the way to Japan. On the right there, we see the Asian brown cloud, which is a large atmospheric disturbance that occurs every year from November through May over eastern China and southern Asia. It's caused by the production of large amounts of aerosols like soot and dust that comes from the combustion of fossil fuels. And these are elements of environmental degradation that can certainly impact human health. Now, ecologists are going to study relationships among organisms and habitats of a lot of different sizes, from microscopic bacteria growing in a fish tank to complex interactions between thousands of plants, animals, and other communities found in the desert. Ecologists will also study lots of different types of environments. They may study microbes that live in soil to plants and animals that live in the rainforest. Because of their work, ecologists have discovered a lot of plants and animals that produce unique chemicals that will actually protect themselves from predators and disease. Some of these chemicals have benefits in the medical world, where we can perhaps either harvest them or synthesize them to treat human diseases. For example, a compound that comes from the Pacific yew is a substance that we can now use to treat cancer. There's a substance that is produced in horseshoe crabs called hemolymph that's actually used in leukemia treatments. Now, biologists, like when we studied early on this year, we focus on the levels of organization from molecules to organisms. So we learned about important molecules like water and DNA, and that molecules come together to build cells, and cells come together to make tissues. The tissues make organs, organs make organ systems, and then really for your general biology, the last level that a lot of times we look at is the organism level. But for ecologists, we go for a much bigger scale. Starting from the organism, the next level is actually a population. And a population is just a group of members of the same species that live in an area and can interbreed with each other. Now, those populations are members of a community of organisms, which are multiple populations of living things working together to create a sustainable system. From communities, we move into ecosystems. And ecosystems are going to include the non-living components of that particular environment. So we have both the living and the non-living components that are then part of that ecosystem. And then our largest level is the biosphere, which is all of the various ecosystems working together to create a self-contained system of life. Now, the biosphere, when we look at it, it actually is kind of patchy, kind of like a quilt of different environments that include land environments and saltwater environments and freshwater environments. These patches basically create unique habitats. And a habitat is a specific environment in which an organism will live. Now, regardless if we're looking at a terrestrial biome or an aquatic life zone, there are going to be various factors that influence what's going to happen in that particular ecosystem. So each habitat is going to have living components, which we refer to as biotic components, and then non-living components, which we call abiotic, where the prefix bio means life. And if you put a or an in front of something, it means not. So our biotic components are going to be living things. And for example, in this little marshy ecosystem, we've got lots of biotic components. We've got our fish, we've got our turtle, we've got bacteria and insects and plants. And then we have all of the abiotic or non-living components of this particular environment. The air, the water, the minerals and things that are in the soil, the sunlight, the wind. But all of those unique factors help to define this given habitat, this specific ecosystem. So we want to look today, start with the idea of populations. And remember, a population is a group of organisms of one specific species. And the population actually grows and competes for resources. Now, populations can either stay the same, they'll increase or decrease according to a given growth rate. The two main factors that influence growth rate are going to be births and deaths. Births obviously are going to increase a population. Deaths are going to decrease a population. Additionally, you might see some other factors that can increase and decrease a population. You may have immigration, where members of another population come in and join to add to a population. And then you may have also immigration, where you have individuals leaving. So our births and our immigration will increase a population, whereas deaths and immigration will decrease a population. And so a formula, which is on the screen there, can help us determine the rate of growth. How much is that population growing in a given year when we take our births plus immigration and we subtract our deaths plus immigration. Now, when a population has access to plenty of resources and very little competition, it will oftentimes exhibit what's called an exponential growth. And with that exponential growth, we see a typical J-shaped curve, a rapidly growing population. But as we know, we don't always have unlimited resources, and rarely are we going to be without competition. So eventually that population is going to reach a point where it cannot grow exponentially anymore. There are certain factors in the environment that's going to push back, that's going to cause environmental resistance. These are limiting factors, like the amount of food, how much competition there is, how much predation. Usually at that point, population levels will eventually level off and create what looks like an S-shaped curve, which is indicative of what's referred to as logistic growth. And so this S-shaped curve is what we see with a lot of populations. Now the maximum number of individuals that an environment can maintain for a period of time is called the carrying capacity. Each environment has a maximum number of individuals because of the limited resources, the competition that's available, that environment is going to support. And so we call that the carrying capacity. Now, typically, when we're looking at carrying capacity, we're going to, in an idealized graph, it's going to look very much like this S-shaped curve. But what's usually going to happen is that the population is going to go up and down around that carrying capacity. That's a little more realistic look at how populations are being maintained in an environment, because some years you might have more resources than another. Now, the carrying capacity is determined by those limiting factors. Now, we can classify limiting factors into two categories. One category is density dependent, and the other is density independent. Density-dependent factors have a greater impact on limiting populations that have high densities, where there's lots of individuals in a small area. Some examples of density-dependent factors would be things like competition. Competition for food, competition for mates, competition for nesting sites. Because we're crowded, those things are going to be much more limiting. Other density-dependent factors will include things like predators, parasites. Parasites are going to be a lot more troublesome if we're more densely populated because they're going to spread so much easier, just like a pathogen. Now, density-independent factors are those things that will affect a population regardless of the size or density of that population. A lot of these density-independent factors are going to be those typical abiotic factors, like the amount of sunlight availability or temperature is going to affect populations whether they are of high density or low density. Now, when a population exceeds its carrying capacity, it cannot stay higher than that carrying capacity for too long. Usually what's going to happen is we're going to have a serious dieback, or in some cases, a population crash. This is a diagram and a photo that's illustrative of one of these examples. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife released caribou into these islands that were found in Alaska because they wanted to provide a protein source for the indigenous peoples that lived there, because it was very difficult to constantly be bringing resources from the mainland to the peoples. So they thought it'd be a great idea to put a small population of caribou onto this island. Well, unfortunately, the indigenous peoples would only take a certain amount, and the reproduction of the caribou exceeded their culling. So their population grew much faster than they could be controlled, and eventually they far exceeded their carrying capacity, and they had a serious population crash. They died from disease and starvation. Population ecology is a study of populations in relation to the environment. Population ecology is important in conservation biology, especially in the development of population viability analysis, which makes it possible to predict long-term probability of a species persisting in a given habitat. By understanding the way that populations grow and interact, we can apply that to human population so that we can understand the viability and the growth of our own population, and how we can coexist with other populations of organisms on this unique biosphere that we call Earth.